All right, joining me now is Joe DeLeone. He covers the draft and college football for us at Believe. So, Joe, how you doing? Thanks for coming on. Thanks for coming on the show.
Doing great. Just got here in Indy and more than excited to see how these guys are going to do on the field. The testing is kicking up very, very soon. It is what is the beginning of always one of the more exciting parts of the draft process. This is when the speed starts to pick up. This is when all the rumors start to swirl. So couldn't be more excited about what's going to happen here in Indy.
I want to start with one of the biggest rumors that's going on right now, and that's Abdul Carter, obviously, and the injury, stress fracture. They're not calling it a fracture. What's going on with him? Will he fall in the draft? What are you hearing?
Yeah, I'm very intrigued by this because this is so new. Like, this is so recent that this happened today and at the end of yesterday that it started to pick up steam. We knew that he had the shoulder injury that he played through in the Peach Bowl against Notre Dame, and he still had an unbelievable game. That was context to why you draft the kid, because he played through the injury and still did so well. But the stress fracture in his foot, the timeline of recovery, I'm no doctor, but it's a little bit wonky to navigate. His availability for testing throughout the rest of this process, it seems like he's not going to be available to do too much. I would bet, knowing that how these things work, and I'm very curious to kind of see who I can probe for information over this weekend, I'd be willing to bet that there's going to be teams picking in the back end of the top 10 that are going to try to drive the narrative that something is seriously wrong with Abdul Carter's foot. And I'm sure that the Jets are a good example of one of those teams, so that he would slide to them. This happens every year. There's always a guy that's in the discussion as being the best prospect. And then there's some really not that serious problem. Like, he's going to heal from the stress fracture. This isn't ligament damage to his knee or to his shoulder. He doesn't have a long injury history that's held him back or hurt him. And it's nothing of like serious concern. It's just an overuse thing. If he slides, it wouldn't shock me. And it would be pretty wild if we do see him go in the back end of the top 10. He'd be a guy that in 2 years, probably, we'd be saying, man, why the heck did we let that get in the way?
I mean, we said the same thing about Jalen Carter, right? With the Eagles. How did he fall? So it's a similar situation here. I mean, you go back all the way to, what was it, Laramie Tunsil, who fell in the draft?
Yeah, I mean, those were more off-field questions, but you're right. It's like we let stupid last-second issues get in the way when, like, the kid's a great player. Like, let's not overthink this.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. And if as a Jets fan, I mean, I'd sit tight at 7. They could use a guy next to Quinnen Williams, and all of a sudden they're set. That's probably their biggest need in this draft.
Yeah, Abdul Carter teeing him off with also McDonald,
Will McDonald, Jermaine Johnson coming back from injury.
Right, you've already got these like great athletic pass rushers. So if you put Abdul Carter into the mix, you would have one of the craziest, deepest defensive lines in the NFL. I kind of wonder if there's better spots in the defense, though, for the Jets to prioritize. And there's talent at those positions in this draft. For them to, at 7, to look at someone like Malachi Starks, the safety from Georgia, who would immediately elevate the quality of play because he's just almost like a middle linebacker with how cerebral and instinctive he is back there. And I also love this idea of Will Johnson, the Michigan corner, another guy who was banged up at the end of the year that is getting pushed this narrative that he has injury problems, but he doesn't, that if he lands in the Jets' lap, that I think that they need to take him.
So you put that on the other side of Sauce, that definitely helps. But I think a lot of the people, when they talked about the Jets defense this past year, specifically, it was a hard time stopping the run. And a lot of it has to do with Quinnen Williams only playing, like 70% of snaps, which made no sense, but that was the way Saleh liked to do it. And obviously when Ulbrich took over, it was the same thing. So I'm just curious that if you put someone else next to Quinnen Williams, all of a sudden that frees up Quinnen to do more. That frees up the outside guys. So I think we saw a little bit of what Will McDonald and Johnson can do, but we could see so much more from those guys. I do think defensive tackle would be the best position for them to go if they decide to go defensive tackle. Who are some other names that you could see being there at 7?
At 7, the two that drive the conversation, and these are two more prospects that I love for what you just described that would play really well off of Quinnen Williams. The one that would be the better fit, but would be a little too early at 7 to take, is Kenneth Grant from Michigan, who's a 340-pound behemoth, has pass rush upside. He reminds me a lot of Dexter Lawrence. He's got good hands as a pass rusher, needs to improve a little bit in the run game, but he can split double teams. he would take up a ton of attention. And that is how you get a guy like Quinn Williams, who's quick-footed, who could be more productive as a pass rusher if he has one-on-one situations. That's how you give him the opportunities to go out there and thrive. And then Kenneth Grant's teammate, Mason Graham, who a little bit more similar prototype to what Quinn Williams is, where quick-footed, flexible, does a really good job of winning with leverage and has the upside to be a 15-sack guy as a defensive tackle. The reason why he would still work in the circumstance, though, is he's in the rare circumstance of being multi-role capable. He can be used in a ton of different ways. He doesn't just need to be a 3-tech. He can play as a 1-tech. He can play head up as a nose. If he wanted to add a little bit more weight, which he certainly can, he weighed in, I think, at 296, which is a little bit on the lighter side. He could eventually go on to be that secondary option because he's shown such a great ability to, again, take tension away from Williams and to anchor well against the run.
Darren Mougey said yesterday that they could potentially trade back. Do you see them trading back in the draft if that's a guy they decide to target?
Yeah, I think that they should. The Jets are one of the first teams, and that was the first thing that popped in my mind when coming into this conversation with you, is that sitting where they are, they should strongly consider taking as many phone calls as possible for really stupidly desperate teams that need a quarterback. I don't think that there's going to be a team willing to take Jalen Milroe or Jackson Dart in the top 10. I really don't think that's going to happen, but you never know. You never know if you could convince somebody hey, we're getting phone calls. All it takes is one impulse decision by a front office member, even an owner, to be I don't want to miss out on this guy to get the trade out. This is probably not going to be a class where you're able to get a really big haul for picks, because the value of the trade up and the quality of the names in this class just aren't as sexy as a normal draft class. But you could still end up getting a lot of later picks, day 2 picks, day 3 picks in a class that has really good defensive depth. And that is something that the Jets need to prioritize.
Yeah, I could see it. Speaking of the quarterbacks, though, obviously everyone's talking about the two at the top of the draft in Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders. How would you rank those two against each other and individually? A lot of people say that they're not even neither of them are top 10 pick worthy. Obviously, we know the quarterbacks end up all just flocking to the top regardless. Would you say that in another draft, these guys would be top 10 quarterbacks?
I think Cam Ward would be, if I were to pick one of the two. I think if last year Cam Ward had declared, if he declared last year, his stock wasn't fully there yet. He needed this year at Miami. But if he was theoretically a part of, with the way that he played this year, a part of last year's class, I would still take him in the range of where Michael Penix was taken. I would actually take him over Michael Penix because he has the big NFL arm. He has the ability to drive the ball into tight windows and to attack downfield. He can just do nutty things that only a very small percentage of NFL quarterbacks can do. The other part about this that I think makes him so dangerous is the poise. Now, he's a risky decision maker. He takes a lot of risks because he's not afraid to make mistakes. I want a quarterback that isn't afraid to make mistakes, because that's what leads to success in the NFL these days, is taking those chances and succeeding on those chances. It's just like I always compare it to in the NBA. You want to take as many 3-point shots as possible because that increases your chances of winning. If you take as many deep shots as possible, risky throws as possible, it increases your chances of winning instead of doing the opposite. So Cam Ward fits that. But again, he needs to be exposed to more NFL spots where he is going to have to be a little bit more willing to take the dump off, a little bit more willing to take the 5-yard route instead of pushing the ball into double coverage because he thinks that his arm can outreach those defensive backs. Shedeur Sanders, though, I think he's more in the Bo Nix range. I think that his athletic tools are not typically there for what we talk about with top 10 quarterbacks. I'm not taking him first overall like some people are starting to drive, because he doesn't have the huge arm. He doesn't have the escapability and the athleticism to overcome those lack of him having a big arm. He's a great decision maker. That's why he's a high floor prospect. That's why I think that he could be exactly like what Teddy Bridgewater was before he suffered the serious knee injury that he suffered. But it's going to be a little bit of a sobering moment. And I think when people realize that he's not like a franchise changer, instead he's just going to be a really quality player, just like Bo Nix was this past year.
Yeah, you mentioned, by the way, you mentioned the Celtics. I think or the NBA last night, the Celtics, right, I think shot 80 field goal attempts and 50 of them were 3-pointers. something like that.
I bet on the Pistons, by the way. I have to give myself a pat on the back. I bet on the
Was
Pistons.
that 9 in a row now for the Pistons?
I know 8. I think it's 8 in a row.
8?
No one's watching them. They're not on TV. They deserve more respect.
they really, instead they're putting the freaking Sixers on national TV every other week. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Yes, the Pistons have been a fun story. There's a lot. And by the way, Amen Thompson's brother's pretty good too. I know, sore, but still, he's Amen Thompson's brother because Amen Thompson is insane.
Right.
Yeah. So back to the quarterbacks for a second. So do you see some of these desperate teams, though, trading up and drafting one of these quarterbacks, particularly the Jets, who you talked about quarterback desperate? Well, as of a couple of weeks ago, they became quarterback desperate.
I think that the Jets are in the spot where they're better off waiting, specifically the Jets, before we kind of talk about these other teams, because you have swung and missed so many times over the last decade in free agency, in the trade market, and twice through the draft with Sam Darnold and Zach Wilson. Being as patient as possible, and if I'm Aaron Glenn, I am emphasizing that patience. Next year's quarterback class might not be like tremendously better, but I would rather look ahead to Drew Allar and take him next year. I would rather see all these teams that are finding success, like the Lions, like the Eagles, that have well-rounded rosters and their quarterbacks stepped in and are elevated because of what's around them. So I think that the Jets should take a step back and let everybody else make the mistake of trying to mortgage their future. The first team that I think is without a doubt the most desperate is the New York Giants. I'm a Giants fan, and sadly I have to admit that we're in this situation because we've done this to ourselves. Joe Shane and Brian Daboll are on the last legs or last chances that they have to prove themselves and their capabilities. They need to go and get a splash pick in order to win themselves more time. I don't think they need to be a playoff team. If they took Cam Ward and they traded up to the first overall spot and Cam Ward leads the offensive rookie of the year discussion, which is very likely because this offensive class is not very good, and if they're one of the first teams out of the playoff mix, they get more time to figure this thing out. But if they sit at 3, they don't get their guy, and they stink again because they just brought in Jameis Winston, they're done. They're out. That doesn't save their jobs. Outside of that, though, like the Raiders haven't had a good quarterback in a long time. There could be a little bit of desperation there. The Browns are the most interesting to pay attention to for the last one because they're so screwed over by this Deshaun Watson thing. Like the how much and how long they're paying him for. They would love to sit where they are and to get somebody as reliable as Shedeur Sanders with so much like unreliability from Deshaun Watson. But I would argue it's bad to throw him into this mess. Like for 4 years of cap hell and not being able to build around him, I would be very afraid if I'm Shedeur Sanders of stepping into that spot with all the resources around him.
Is Tennessee going to take a quarterback at 1?
I'm on both sides with this because like the one side that I see is that they should make the decision to go after either Matthew Stafford or they should make the decision to aggressively go after Sam Darnold. They have an offensive line that's underrated, that they've invested multiple first-round picks, that they could eventually create a circumstance for success in a pretty historically weak division. But outside of that, if they're not going to go like all in and trying to be like really competitive right now, I think that they're better trading back and taking advantage of what they're given, which is the chance to swindle somebody that we keep talking about here. Let the Giants call. Let the Giants offer you something obnoxious. Move back a couple of picks. Take Abdul Carter. Take Travis Hunter. And then reap the rewards in a couple of years. I think of how the Panthers traded up with the Bears, and the Bears were the ones who benefited from that. They benefited from the circumstance of accumulating extra picks and then taking Caleb Williams instead of taking Bryce Young and having a weak roster with less receivers and less offensive linemen that they ended up picking with the draft haul that they got. If I'm the Titans, I'm trading back, though. I think that that's best for their success.
Yeah, Bryce Young definitely turned it around more towards the end of the season. But you started the podcast saying that this is rumor season. There have been rumors that the Jets would be interested in Jackson Dart. Do you see them taking Jackson Dart at 7?
I don't think it's 7. I don't think that Jackson Dart is the type of quarterback that we're taking at 7. Like we're talking about here about Shedeur Sanders not typically being a top 10 guy. He just doesn't like tools wise do it for me. He's accurate. He's a better athlete than he gets credit for. He makes a lot of weird mistakes sometimes on film. I think if I'm the Jets, and this kind of plays better for their circumstance for like what we're talking about here, on day 2, he is exactly who I would pursue. Like in the second round, at the beginning of the second round, or even if he's somehow still on the board in the third round, which I don't think is going to happen. If you draft him, you get the opportunity to see what he's like. If he's not worthy of starting, he goes on to be one of the best backups in the NFL. Like, I think that's absolutely in his wheelhouse and his capability because he's played so much ball. He shows good poise, decision-making, all those things. Or if he shows him being a high-floor guy that is capable to contribute, he could go up on to end up being a Derek Carr. And that's my comparison for him. I think that he could be Derek Carr, where when he was drafted by the Raiders, no one really thought like, hey, is this really worth the pick? Like, should we have taken this guy? He ended up being an important player for them for a stretch. I mean, he was a big reason why they made the playoffs the 1 year before he got hurt. I think Jackson Dart's definitely worth considering, but just not at that 7th overall spot. That would be a waste of a pick, frankly.
I agree with you that the Jets should go with something more patient, a more patient approach, maybe stockpile some more picks, get some defensive depth, try and build the roster, like you said, like they did in Detroit or Philadelphia. And another benefit to that would be maybe you get to see what Jordan Travis has. Can you tell me a little bit more about Jordan Travis? He's on the roster, but no one's seen him. I feel like no one's talking about him. Like, he's on the roster, and you might as well see what you have in him, right?
Jordan Travis was like really interesting last cycle because he was being billed as athletic kid, successful starter for a very long period of time. I mean, we saw this past year how much of an important player he was for Florida State's success, so much so that they've completely fell off a cliff. Now, there were other underlying factors, but I digress. I would love to see what he does during training camp because you're right. There's something there. There 100% is something there because he has it on tape, the escapability, the ability to create plays and to keep an offense on schedule and moving forward. I just don't fully know from like an arm talent standpoint if he's like actually really there and good enough to be a premier starter in the league. But the rumor and the speculation that Tyrod Taylor comes back, I'd absolutely would let them compete and see if Jordan Travis could pressure him. And if it's a close margin, I would start Travis. The other option, by the way, that kind of like a very similar circumstance, Aaron Glenn, I would consider trading for Hendon Hooker. I don't know how they currently view Hendon Hooker from Tennessee a couple years ago. Sam Deal suffered an injury at the end of his time at Tennessee, even though he was trending towards possibly being a first-round pick. We haven't heard anything from him. He's never going to start over Jared Goff, but maybe he's somebody who Aaron Glenn's been around that could at least come in and compete. And if he doesn't start, he would beat out Jordan Travis to be a steady quality backup.
Yeah, I have seen that. And it's not the worst decision. I don't understand how you get rid of Aaron Rodgers and say we're trying to win now. I just don't think that's true. I think they're not trying to win now. I think they're trying to build the roster back up and see what they have here. So we talked a lot about that on the defensive side. On the offensive side, last year they obviously passed on Brock Bowers to take Olu Fashanu, which I think is the right decision. Their offensive line is locked in. If you look at specifically the three guys, obviously, in Tippmann, Fashanu, and AVT, that's pretty much locked in for the next 10 years. You could lock those guys in as really good NFL players. Obviously, with John Simpson, and I would love to have Morgan Moses back, that's a great offensive line, a really good underrated offensive line in the league. But is now the year that they look to add something next to Brees and Garrett Wilson? Obviously, we don't know what the status of Devontae Adams is going to be, but do they look for the Penn State tight end, Tyler Warren, or someone else, maybe in the second round, the wide receiver? What do you see them going down that route?
I think that they should, and it's a name. Tyler Warren's been a guy that's been brought up with that 7th overall pick, and I think it's one that needs to be recirculated consistently. And if they do trade back, Colston Loveland from Michigan is also in the mix. I think that honestly should be. We could talk so much about these defensive prospects because it's a great defensive draft, and I would actually almost consider for the Jets angle that it might be better for them with how much depth there is at defensive tackle and at edge, knowing that you've already got good players there to address that on day 2 and on day 3. There aren't a lot of good receivers. There are not a lot of good tight ends in this class, and there's also a lot of great running back depth, which can be addressed later in the draft as well. Tyler Warren at 3 is a guy that I'm looking for. Like, he is a guy who is a reliable receiver. He can be used as a multi-use weapon coming out of, taking the snaps out of shotgun and being a wildcat quarterback like we saw at Penn State. Hopefully the NFL lets him do that. But his reliability for whoever ends up being the next quarterback, getting him in now, what I think should be an emphasis point. On top of this at receiver, there's not a lot of great options, but on day 2, you could look at guys like Xavier Restrepo from Miami. You could look at guys like I really like Jaden Higgins from Iowa State, who's a tall, long guy who's 6'4" and moves really well for his size. So there's options. They should try to address it early because outside of Garrett Wilson, there's just not much production.
Yeah, and by the way, I think he'd immediately be the best receiving tight end since Dustin Keller for the Jets. Without
a doubt.
They haven't had that go-to guy at tight end basically since I was in middle school. So it would be nice if they did go down that route. You mentioned running backs for a second. I do want to ask you this. So after the season we saw from Saquon Barkley, and then obviously all the different running backs, whether it's Tony Pollard or Josh Jacobs or Aaron Jones, who found new homes and all of a sudden had these big bumps and these good years. How much does that affect Ashton Genty's his stock, I guess, in this draft? Does that give him a bump?
I think it does the opposite, because I think there's certainly going to be teams that are looking at that way. But Saquon Barkley's success, we need to pay attention to what his career trajectory was like. He was taken way too early by a bad team. Mm-hmm. And there was a hope that the Giants were going to be able to get so much out of him that he was going to drive them to success. And that didn't come to fruition, because drafting a good running back, an elite running back, is a luxury pick. He goes to the Eagles, a situation that's already built and well-rounded. He finds success because everything around him is so great, and goes on to have one of the greatest running back seasons ever. We need to pay attention to the fact that Ashton Genty should be considered in that same light. The only first pick that would make sense for me would be the Dallas Cowboys. I keep seeing this possibility that he goes to the Raiders. The Raiders have so many problems they need to address. Taking Genty does not fix any of those. Their offensive line needs help. But at least with Dallas, they've invested in their offensive line over the past couple of drafts. I know that they just lost Zach Martin. They have CeeDee Lamb. They have Dak Prescott. They've got Micah Parsons on defense and Diggs in their secondary. You put Genty into the mix when they had no running back production last year. Awful running back production. Rico Dowdle is not good. He should not be the guy that you're turning to. This was a practice squad level guy that was getting as many snaps as he was.
I mean, Zeke was getting snaps.
Right. Yeah. None of it made sense what they were doing running the football. Genty could explode because he's a home run threat, but anyone outside earlier than that, no. Genty needs to go. And as a Ashton Genty fan and a lover of his play, I want to see him go where he's going to play the best. I don't want to see him getting blasted behind a bad offensive line. That would be such a waste.
You also do a gambling show, right?
Oh yeah, I do gambling coverage. Yes.
So I guess you are a gambling man. If you had to predict, just place a bet. Again, but top 5 picks in the draft, how does it look? If you want, you could go to 7 just to include the Jets. But
if I were to just pitch it right now, and there's obviously a lot that can currently change. Say there's no trades. I think that Cam Ward probably goes 1 with the opportunity for a trade there, that the Titans either take him or somebody trades up and takes him. Number 2 for me feels like it's likely Abdul Carter if it's the Browns sitting there, or again, somebody trades up. 3 strongly feels like that could be the earliest spot for Shedeur Sanders, or it ends up being Travis Hunter. The Giants sit there. I think it does be Shedeur Sanders. 4 for the Patriots feels really strong for that to be where Travis Hunter is picked. And then 5 for Jacksonville, the 2 that make the most sense, Mason Graham from Michigan or Will Johnson also from Michigan could be in play. Sitting at 6, where we have the Raiders, they're another team that I think needs to prioritize defense, and their priority should probably be Mason Graham, Will Johnson, or maybe considering taking somebody like James Pierce Jr. And then where the Jets sit, they're in the mix for all 3 of those prospects as well, of being Mason Graham, Will Johnson, or James Pierce.
Yeah, so that's pretty good. Would you say that Hunter's going to play both sides in the NFL?
I don't think it's going to be on a full-time basis. I think what it'll end up being is that he'll be a corner, because it's a lot harder to find good corners in the NFL. It's a lot harder to find guys that have the range and the burst and the fluidity that he has, and also the just easy, raw reactiveness that he played with, the way that he was able to make plays when the ball was in the air that most guys, 1% of guys in the NFL, can make. That's where the rareness comes into play. He's a good receiver. He can be a good receiver, but I think a team is going to draft him play corner, and then have him contribute occasionally at receiver. And I also think partially, if you're like a lockdown corner, you're not facing a lot of contact. But if you're a receiver, you're getting hit more often, especially if he ended up being a team's number one receiver. You're getting hit quite often. So I think NFL teams would like him to be a corner and then start to get snaps at receiver eventually.
Got it. Well, plug all your stuff. Tell us where we can find your work.
Yeah, you can catch me on Twitter at Joe DeLeone, host of the Rufino and Joe Show and Hack City on Believe, and then the A to Z Film Room, part of A to Z Sports, which is, we do great NFL draft coverage. Me and my co-host Ryan Roberts, we're going to be doing a lot during the NFL Combine, and there's plenty more that's going to be happening. Rami, appreciate it getting to catch up with you, and I'm sure we'll get to talk soon.
Yep. Thank you so much. That's Joe. Everyone go check him out. And if you're in a Starbucks, just be careful there in India, right?
Yeah, definitely will try to have my head on a swivel.
All right. Thanks for your time.